Oh, you're muted.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Great. Thanks, Colleen, and thanks, Wenix, for the introductions. My name is Andrew Addessi. I joined the CTUIR staff in 2017 as a forester, and since 2019, I've been in the position of supervisory forester. And I'm going to be joined today by Jeff Casey. Jeff, do you want to chime in and just say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Wonderful invocation. Colleen, thanks for throwing this together. My name is Jeff Casey. I'm the Fire Management Officer for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I work quite closely with Andrew and the Natural Resources Department to include Forestry and Wildlife. And Andy will give you a really great overview of what's going on. And then after he gets done, I got a few slides. We'll talk about prescribed fire and traditional knowledge, returning fire to the land, and then you won't have to listen to him anymore. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to try to get my slides up now. And sorry.
We can see your slides and we can hear you.
I think that's not the slide I want, though. Just 1 second, I'm sorry. Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, outline of presentation.
Okay, and it's not in presenter view.
It is, it's full screen.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So from the introduction, one of the key themes that Colleen asked me and Jeff to discuss today was the topic of collaborative forest management, and particularly opportunities for the tribe to co-manage forests throughout the ceded territory using prescribed or cultural fire. But I wanted to give a background concerning kind of the organizational structure of our forestry program and the approach that we've been implementing on the reservation using the tribe's forest management plan and first foods mission. And then later, Jeff will talk more specifically to prescribed fire as well. So the forestry program is housed within CTUIR. We're under the Department of Natural Resources in the Range Ag and Forestry program. I supervise a small team of foresters and technicians, and we're tasked with implementing forest management on the reservation. But we work closely with other programs in DNR on related issues to range, first foods, and other natural resource concerns. My supervisor, Gordy Schumacher, he manages the entire RAFT program, of which Cheryl is one of our staff as well. He's really our resident expert on high-level funding and administrative issues. He's been with first the BIA and now the tribe for the past 20 years or so. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to speak today, so I'm going to do my best to talk about these topics as best I can. So forestry, like many of the programs now managed by CTUIR, is operated under a 638 compact agreement. Essentially, a 638 compact is an agreement that allows the tribe to directly manage a function previously controlled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So with the 638 compact agreement, the BIA provides annual funding to the tribe for us to operate our staff and to implement our forest management. But in turn, our program has to ensure that all applicable federal laws and codes relevant to managing trust resources are followed. So in 2009, the forestry program was compacted for the tribe, and then it took about a year and a half of scoping and work with the tribal community, with commissions, with natural resource staff within the tribe to develop a forest management plan. And this was a prerequisite for the tribe to be able to actively manage their own forest land. So the management plan incorporates many values and resources identified as important to the tribe. And we also have to follow all these relevant codes and laws relevant to federal land. So some of these laws include the National Environmental Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, among many others. And there's also a series of tribal codes that have been developed in order to ensure that the tribal resource values are protected as well. So all of this is incorporated into that forest management plan. This management plan gives a recommended approach for protecting or enhancing these desired values, and also gives a rough timeline for implementing this work in a proactive and sustained way. However, I'll mention that we do have some flexibility to shift our focus if there's forest health emergencies or wildfires that arise. And later I'm going to show you how over the last several years, many of our projects have been shaped in response to growing insect outbreaks and the risk of catastrophic wildfire. And many of these impacts are only going to be heightened in the face of future climate change. And so it's really important for us to, we're in both kind of reactive and a proactive stance right now. Last thing I'll mention is that there's the funding opportunities kind of shape how we prioritize certain projects as well. And there's just been a real growth in funding available for fuels related treatments based on the rising recognition of the threat of wildfire to communities across the West and across agency boundaries. So here's a basic list of some of the values incorporated into that management plan. And I won't go into all of them, but I'll just say that in terms of timber management, which is an aspect of what we're doing in terms of forest management, we manage in a sustained yield way. The idea being that whatever timber management we do, whatever volume of timber we take from the landscape, we're ensuring that there's growth each year that's going to replace that volume, and so that there's always forest land perpetually on the landscape for the tribe to manage for these diverse values. We also incorporate the First Foods mission, and this has been further refined by the recent Upland Vision document, which kind of a high-level quote is that we're trying to maintain healthy, resilient, dynamic upland ecosystems able to support continued natural production of first foods. And just in general, I see what we're doing through the basic lens of we're trying to maintain forest health, so we're trying to retain resilient stands, and we're also trying to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire potential, wiping out large segments of the forest and some of the resource values associated with that. You might wonder why we even manage forest land. I mean, wouldn't the best outcome, ecologically at least, be just to let the forest grow naturally with minimal intervention? Last month, Lindsay Kiono of our wildlife program did a great job introducing some of these topics of east side or dry forest ecology and some of the restoration focus of this work. She was speaking in connection with some of the work our wildlife program does on the rainwater property in Washington State. And just to kind of recap some of these concepts, the forests of the inland Northwest co-evolved with wildfire as a natural and driving disturbance. And this was in the form of natural lighted wildfires through lightning, or there's also a real growing recognition in the literature of the large scale and frequency of managed fire by indigenous peoples and kind of the scale that they had on the landscape. And they use fire to maintain forests suitable for their culturally important foods and plants. There's a huge body of science recognizing that in a lot of these forests that we manage, fire burned every 5 to 20 years on a given point of land in some of the drier areas, and in some of the wetter areas, maybe every 20 to 50 years. So pretty frequently. But since the settlement in the area of European Americans, there's been a general policy of fire exclusion. Basically, wildfire is bad and extinguish all your wildfires, kind of epitomized by the Smokey Bear campaign. So, and on top of that, kind of the timber management of the 20th century really focused on the economics and value of the trees, and so the emphasis is really on removing the large old growth and often fire adapted tree species from the forest. And so what has resulted in all of this is that now we have forest land that's really overgrown with shade tolerant, fire intolerant tree species like grand fir and to a certain extent Douglas fir, and they're much higher densities than historically there ever was. There's a great series of work done to recreate these panoramic photos that were first captured in the 1930s across the Forest Service land of the inland Northwest. And in the past decade, some researchers with the Forest Service have been trying to recreate these photos, and they really give a very clear sense of some of the changes to the landscape that have occurred because of this fire suppression. Here's a photo from the Eagle Cap Wilderness, and in the top you can really see you have a very diverse set of habitats. You have open grasslands and meadows. You have stands of different age classes, but with fire exclusion and with some of the timber activities, what has resulted across the West is forests that are very homogeneous. There's a much greater density of trees and a density of fuels, and overall this poses a large risk for long-term management of these forests, because when fire does happen, you get really catastrophic effects. This is a photo of kind of an old growth stand that might have been common in the 1900s, early 1900s. And this type of forest has really become more rare on the landscape. You can imagine if a fire were going through the stand, it just kind of burn the light litter and grass on the forest floor and leave these larger trees unscathed. Maybe a few of the smaller trees would burn up in the process, but the fire would actually would maintain the stand in perpetuity. And so this is kind of a vision of what an old growth stand might be, and something we're trying to manage to have more of on the landscape. Instead, we have a lot of stands that look more like this, and you could see just how heavily dense it is. And all these trees are stressed for light, for water, for nutrients. And obviously, if a fire started in the stand, very little of the stand might be able to survive. Instead, it might turn into a fire like this. And extreme wildfires are really bad. They can sterilize soils, they can deplete native tree and understory plant seed banks, promote invasive species, and just generally alter the natural succession of this forested area. Not to mention all the negative effects if there's people and communities living near these stands. These extreme wildfires have extremely negative effects, and we've seen that year after year now in these major wildfires across the West. So even if the stand doesn't burn right away, without fire, overly dense stands become really susceptible to different forest health concerns. One of the major ones is insect outbreaks. In this photo, we have represented a western pine beetle. We also see a lot of pine engraver beetle as well in our forests, our dry forests right now. Often beetle outbreaks are secondary agents that kill trees that are already in a general state of weakness or stress because they're in overly dense stands. So the drought stress in these stands is further amplified by the type of conditions we're seeing with climate change, namely minimal snowpack in the winters and above average summer temperatures. And so these years of drought and little water further make these stands susceptible to beetles. So just to circle back to how our forest management plan tasks us with mitigating these issues while also promoting the other important values that the tribe has for forests. Our overarching strategy is stand density management. So we seek to reduce the density of trees that are growing in overgrown stands to appropriate densities for the site, densities that the amount of water and nutrients in that soil can maintain. But we're also trying to maintain structurally diverse stands that are consistent with the historic structure of these forest lands. And we use what's called in forestry an uneven age management regime, meaning that we don't do clear cutting, except maybe if there's a really major forest health issue in that stand that has to be removed. Generally, we try to do what's called single tree selection. So we're actually going through these forests and we're identifying the types of trees that have the characteristics we're trying to retain, and in the process, removing trees that aren't supporting that type of structure. So we favor large diameter trees that are healthy, that are straight, have good genetics. We favor fire tolerant tree species such as ponderosa pine or western larch. In this process, we're trying to maintain and enhance suitable habitat for first foods. A lot of the important first foods, game or huckleberries or roots, they require more sunlight than is available in these overly dense stands. And so in the process of doing these treatments, we're hoping to improve the habitat for those first foods. Again, we're trying to reduce the buildup and continuity of surface or ladder fuel so that if there is a wildfire, whether human caused, whether a natural ignition from lightning, or whether from prescribed fire, we're not having these negative consequences on the forest, that it's just going to stay to the forest floor and do minimal large scale damage to the stand. And so in all the projects that we do, in all the different types of treatments, we're trying to simulate the structure of a forest that would naturally develop with fire through these mechanical thinnings or hand thinnings. And then as a follow-up, we try to re-implement prescribed fire. This takes care of both the activity fuels that we create in those projects, but is also returning fire to its natural role in the ecosystem. And over the long term, we can maintain a fire schedule every 10, 20, 30 years in these stands. And so we'd actually be recreating that natural fire regime. And another aspect that takes up a lot of my time is when we were doing a thinning in which the trees are of a size that they are valuable as timber, we have to ensure that we're providing a fair economic return for the landowners and following all the codes and laws related to distribution of funds to trust beneficiaries. So it talks about kind of what we're doing and why. You might be asking, where are we working? And so just a map showing you the general forest space on the reservation. We manage about 27,000 acres of forest land. However, a lot of this land is very topographically complex. We have huge river canyons, stringers that are bordered by kind of scablands and rock outcroppings. And so a lot of our forest is really based on topography, the aspect and slope of the stand. And so that's a challenge for doing kind of large scale management when you have such varied topography. And in fact, probably about 40% of our land base is in a way that it's unfeasible economically to do some of the types of active management which you might try to. And so large areas are set aside just for wildlife in which we're not doing any active management, Esculpa Creek being one of those areas. Another complication of doing forest management is the land ownership. Many of you are familiar with the maps of the reservation, but this highly checkerboard pattern of the reservation is a huge administrative challenge. I mean, there's large segments within the reservation boundary that are in private fee status, which we do not manage in any way. aside from just ensuring that whatever private landowners are living there are following our management plan. There's also a high number of utilities, highways, roads, power lines, and these all further fragment the landscape and make planning and performing forest management really complex. And this is really critical in relation to prescribed fire, because as you know, fire does not respect property lines. And so when we're implementing prescribed fire, it makes it much more important that we ensure that the fire stays where we want it to. And so that's why doing these kind of early treatments are that much more necessary. So under the forest management plan over the last decade, we've begun building our capacity to do proactive forest management. Some of the early work involved getting a really good inventory of what our forest resource was, what the stand conditions were. And so we did a lot of what's called cruising or inventory work to establish that inventory base. And a lot of the early work was kind of protecting really high value sites. There's a few aspen stands still on the reservation. And so a lot of early work was trying to protect these stands, trying to remove conifers that were encroaching on the aspens, and then also building these buck and rail fences, which you can see here, which exclude grazing livestock or elk or deer who like to munch on the little shoots of the aspen trees. And so when you remove that grazing pressure, these stands can actually regenerate and grow into maturity again. And then starting in about 2014, our program really began to ramp up its ability to manage the forest land. This map you see here will be replicated on a number of slides coming up here just to show you the scale and some of the different projects we've been doing. And our first commercial timber sale was in 2014 on what's called the scattered tracts units. This was an area that was lined out in the forest management plan as kind of the first area to manage for. This project really gave our staff a lot more experience navigating the administrative process for doing commercial timber harvest and implementing it with logging contractors, getting the types of the stand conditions that we were looking for. It was generally pretty simple in that it was just one ownership type. It was just tribal trust land, and it was relatively flat ground. But this is not representative of all of the forest space, but it was a great start for us to learn this process. Also, in the mid-2010s, we started a series of what's called mastication thinning projects, really focusing on the understory trees. The South Reservation near Indian Lake was really affected by spruce budworm in the 1980s, and some of that management to remove the spruce budworm and to salvage the timber that was lost because of the outbreak left stands that are really have a large predominance of shade-tolerant tree species like grand fir. And so these trees can grow really, really thick in the understory because they're so shade-tolerant. And so you can see here on this image in the top right, this is kind of a more or less a before and after shot of what mastication thinning does. So on the left is the stand, and you see it's so thick. The stand has very little wildlife value because of that. There's no light getting to the forest floor and no forage, and animals also just can't really navigate through these types of stands. And so mastication involves using a tracked equipment with like a spinning or disc head on it that grinds these trees and creates a mulch with them. And so it's really great because it takes care of the understory density and also the fuel density as well by creating this mulch layer. So we've done a lot of work on the South Reservation using this type of method. We've also done some hand thinning on Cabbage Hill. Again, hand thinning is effective for the understory. We followed up with some burning, either broadcast or pile burning of some of the activity fuels we created. A lot of these stands also have a high component of larger trees that need to be thinned to get these stands at the correct density. And so we're looking in the next few years at doing a little bit more commercial thinning in these stands to really reduce the density. So I mentioned earlier that wildfires and forest health issues have helped shape where we're going in the future. And one of these was the Way Station fire of 2016, which burned about 200 acres of tribal forest land, much of it very severely. And in the following year, our program implemented a salvage harvest, removing those trees that burned up and died and retaining the value for the landowners. And that gave us the opportunity to replant these stands so that they'll regenerate as forest into the future. Meanwhile, about the same time, it was becoming really clear that there's a growing bark beetle epidemic. And this followed a number of record dry and hot summers, and then further was exacerbated by the Way Station fire because those beetles got into those trees that were burned during the fire, and they regenerated and they started spreading to the surrounding stands. And so this problem has continued to grow over the last several years. You can see here an image of the I-84 corridor, and these red and yellow polygons show you the scale of this growing bark beetle epidemic. This is taken from the U.S. Forest Service Aerial Detection Survey, where they fly planes over forest land and detect forest health issues. And this is just an aerial image from Google Maps, and then kind of a stand level image of the impacts of this bark beetle outbreak on these stands. But at the same time, we had some inertia in our program. We were trying to finish treating the rest of the Emigrant Springs compartment as outlined in the Forest Management Plan. And so we started this project in 2018, but had been planning it since about 2015, and just finished this past year, at least the commercial thinning part of it. This project is really notable just because of the complexity of the terrain and land ownership that was involved in it. This map kind of shows you all the different parcels, and a lot of them were embedded in private or industrial forest land, which we had to work with different landowners in order to access these properties and to be able to do this management. But I think it was very successful given all this complexity that we're able to carry out this project. And it was also notable because of the terrain. This was the first commercial timber harvest that, as far as I know, has been done on the reservation that involved really steep terrain. We had some challenges getting an operator who's able to have the equipment and make it feasible for them to do the type of thinning treatment. But one of our local logging companies was able to invest specifically in machinery capable of doing this type of work. Now, this image in the top left shows you this machinery. That the image is not from our ground because it shows a clear-cut operation. But it gives you a sense of the type of machinery being used, and basically a machine suspended by a cable to an anchoring machine that's able to descend these steep slopes. These pictures on the lower portion of the slide show you that we were effective in getting kind of this uneven age management regime using this type of harvesting equipment. So I think it was a great success in that regard. Now, following up, we're going to continue on, and we've been laying out some commercial thinning blocks just to the west of Emigrant Springs in what's called the North Fork Mackay compartment. Again, these are some of the stands that have been most heavily impacted by bark beetle, and so we're trying to, we're trying to get whatever value for the dead trees that have for the landowners, and also to protect the stands that are adjacent to it by doing proactive thinning so that they can resist that pressure of bark beetles. And here's a map of the area if you're interested to come back and take a look at a little bit more detail at our logging plan for it. But in total, it'll be about 850 acres of commercial thinning. Another project I'm excited about that's coming up this year is we got funding for a pre-commercial thinning and road brushing project on what's called Blue Kettle Ridge, what we call Blue Kettle Ridge. This is the northernmost area on the southern reservation block. Basically, the area is the road has become so overgrown from vegetation that it's basically inaccessible by car or truck. So a major emphasis is just brushing the road out and creating a little bit of a fuel break around the road. And they're also going to do some proactive pre-commercial thinning in some of the overgrown stands. And so hopefully this will allow for, if there ever is a need for fire suppression in this area, folks to access it. But also we really just want tribal members to be able to access this area because there's some great gathering areas and hunting areas in this part of the reservation that have been previously pretty inaccessible. A final thing I'll talk about is the Reserve Treaty Rights Lands Project. Essentially, this is a grant program through the BIA, which has come online in the last few years, and it gives funding to treat lands that are not necessarily trust lands, but that are of high tribal priority that are adjacent or within tribal boundaries. So as I mentioned before, the land ownership, we have a lot of land that's been recently purchased by the tribe over the last decade or so that's in what's called tribal fee status. And we don't get any direct annual funding to manage those lands because they're not trust lands. And so this RTRL grant program has really bridged that gap, giving us funding to do forest management on these tribal fee lands within the reservation boundary. But moving forward, we certainly could be able to get projects funded through this grant program on lands just off reservation, maybe in federal ownership. So we're excited about this opportunity. And we've had 3 major projects funded under this: the Telephone Burns RTRL, and the 4th RTRL, which is just coming online now. And then the wildlife program spoke about the rainwater RTRL project they're carrying out. And just some images and maps. One thing I'll mention when we're trying to implement prescribed fire, the forest treatment is really important, but also sometimes we need to create containment lines to ensure the fire goes where we want it. And so this photo in the top left shows you an image of using a skid steer to create some pretty shallow containment lines that we could burn off of. And that way, we don't burn over onto private lands or state lands, like in the lower left where the Burns properties are surrounded by different ownership types that we really want to make sure we don't accidentally burn over onto. And then the bottom right shows you the plan for the 4th RTRL project. Essentially, we're going to be implementing about 500 acres of thinning or forest treatments every year, and then following up with prescribed fire. And over about 5 years, we'll treat about 2,000 acres this way. And then just to recap kind of long-range planning within the reservation, we want to continue to address these stands being affected by the bark beetles. And so we have a long-range plan to keep doing thinning treatments, this time moving north of I-84 and working in what we call Cabbage Hill or the Esculpa Creek and Telephone Ridge compartments as well. So I wanted to get to some of the collaborative opportunities for managing. As you can see, we have a lot of work for us just within the reservation boundary, but there's certainly a lot of opportunity right now for doing work off reservation lands, but that target tribal priorities. The first thing is that the tribe meets annually with the U.S. Forest Service, the three forests in their ceded territory. This map on the left shows you the black outline is the ceded territory for the tribe, and then this dark green patch is the U.S. Forest Service network. And there's some other agency partners as well. And basically every year, our natural resource staff, as well as our board of trustees, meets with the Forest Service and talks about their scope of work, the work that they're doing, and the tribe reasserts their values and their interests in seeing how the forest is managed across the ceded territory. There's some new funding mechanisms that come online over the last decade or so. In 2004, the Tribal Forest Protection Act was enacted, which basically gives the tribe the ability to advocate for a specific forest treatment that's on Forest Service land, but that meets tribal priorities. One of the limitations is there's not really funding for this, and so somehow you have to be creative to get funding to do that. And our tribe has not yet enacted a Tribal Forest Protection Act project. Very similar is Good Neighbor Authority, which developed more for states to be able to do that kind of cross-boundary management with the Forest Service. But the authority to do those types of projects is been extended to tribes in 2018. But again, there's no direct allocation of funding every year for that. I spoke about the Reserve Treaty Rights Lands grant proposal, and that's a really great funding source for continuing to do work on and off the reservation. And one last thing I want to bring up is this Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And this is a lot of buzz around this right now. Basically, in last year, the Umatilla National Forest and Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, along with a whole host of signing partners, submitted an application for this grant program, and essentially gave these forests a huge pulse of money to be able to ramp up their ability to do active forest management across the landscape and across ownerships in order to provide more wildfire resilience to the landscape. If fully funded over 10 years, it would amount to between $30 and $40 million in new funding. And the proposal outlines an ambitious schedule of about 500,000 acres of active forest management, as well as another 400,000 acres that could be set up for natural wildfire. Really, the overarching goal of that program is to prepare the landscape for the beneficial use of naturally ignited wildfire and increasing capacity of the Forest Service and agency partners to implement that work. There's a lot of interest in tribal participation or partnership in this program. A big part of the push of this program is for collaborative land management to take place across agencies. And so I'm really excited for some opportunities for the tribe to be involved and to identify some areas of priority to be managed along the reservation boundary and across the ceded territory. So that's all I wanted to talk about. I wanted to give some minutes for Jeff Casey to speak about implementing prescribed fire.
Okay, go ahead and hit the next slide, Andy. I really appreciated Andy's presentation and giving a really good background and explanation as how the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the CTUIR work together to meet natural resource management goals and objectives, particularly in forest management. As Andy mentioned, since 2009, the all natural resource programs for the tribe have been 638'd back to the tribe for their direct control, except for wildland fire management. And so that does present some unique challenges with working between the two agencies, but I also think it's some great opportunities working with the tribe and moving forward and using fire as a management tool on the land is, I think, it has been and will continue to be very successful here. And I've worked several other places and with the tribes and BIA, and I'm really this is the best relationship that I've ever seen between the tribal natural resources and BIA fire. So that's really appreciated. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Andy. Okay, so As I said before, I'm the fire management officer, and this is an organization chart for the BIA Umatilla Agency Fire Management Program. As you can see, it's a combination of both BIA and tribal positions, and the organization is set up in such a way that if a tribal employee, on an engine crew would like to move up the ladder and become the senior firefighter and then the assistant fire management officer and eventually the fire management officer, there is that career ladder for them. This fire program has been fairly successful since I've been here, and I could not say that without the help and assistance of the tribe, not only just the natural resource folks, but definitely the board of trustees, human resources, IT. I mean, it's just the interaction and the cooperation that has gone on has just been exceptional, and I really appreciate that. Go ahead with the next slide, Andy. Okay, so the mission of the BIA, part of the actual mission statement is that the BIA is here to protect and improve trust resources for Native Americans, Native American tribes, and Alaskan Natives. So with the guidance and mission from the BIA to protect and improve trust resources, there's really two different ways that we do that. First of all, when it comes to protecting trust resources, we have since last year have become responsible for all the fire suppression on the trust and latted lands within the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and that's approximately 190,000 acres. The organization chart that you just seen has expanded a lot since I've been here. When I showed up here 4 years ago, it was an FMO and an engine boss. And with BIA realizing that we had quite a bit more responsibility now to protect trust resources and most importantly, life and property of tribal members on the reservation, they have been providing more money so we could increase our organization. When it comes to improving trust resources, I really like that as part of the BIA mission because no other federal agency that I know of actually has that in their mission statement. They are going to improve resources. And so the Umatilla Agency Fire Management Program is responsible for, number one, fuels management to reduce the potential for catastrophic wildfire because we are fire guys, but just as importantly, we're responsible for the application of fire as a management tool. And as I stated before, in conjunction and coordination with tribal forestry, wildlife, and range programs, we're really taking a step in that direction, and we're really doing some good stuff and having some good stuff planned. A new word that's really come into popularity over the last 5 years, maybe 10 years, has been traditional knowledge. And traditional knowledge is simply that finally science is starting to realize that the folks that were here pre-European settlement were actually pretty darn good land managers, and that there wasn't just passive management. They actually were using fire as a management tool to meet some needs. And it just so happens that an article I wrote about that came out in the most recent edition of the Confederated Umatilla Journal. So if you guys would like to take a look at that, I think that explains that pretty good. But right now, our goal and our marching orders are to utilize tribal or traditional knowledge and modern fire science to be able to meet the goals and objectives as stated in the Tribal Resource Management Plan, and to be able to, improve the trust resources out there. Go ahead and hit the next slide, Andy. Okay, there we go. The next slide that comes up, that's just, kind of for your guys' information, your folks' information. That's a list of projects that we are working in for this year, for 2021, that we're working in conjunction with tribal Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife, and Forestry primarily to use fire as a management tool. Also, there's Andy was talking in his presentation about mastication. He was talking about using mechanical means such as chainsaws to do some thinning and some cutting, some piling. I mean, all those projects are listed on there, and this is really the way that I, as the BIA representative, go ahead and request money, some of which gets passed through to the tribe to, implement these projects. Andy had also mentioned the RTRL funding and projects, and you can see that the ones that he mentioned are on there. I am happy that over the last 3 years, we've been able to bring about $1.3 million to the tribe through the RTRL project for hazardous fuels reduction and forest health. And I think, that really gives us the opportunity and ability to go out there, go forward and do good things. Next slide, Andy. I kind of threw this one in here at last thought, folks, because I felt it was important that you saw some faces of the people that are out there with fire management, doing your fire suppression and working with tribal DNR to get your get some fire on the ground, do some prescribed burning. And when I look at this picture, I was pretty pleased because another mission of the BIA is to promote economic opportunities for tribal members. And I'm happy to say that in that picture, of the 12 people in that picture, 6 of those folks are tribal members. Or actually, 5 of those folks are tribal members, 6 of those folks are native. So, I really try to, open opportunities for young people that want to get on the seasonal fire crew, make some money, and actually be able to help their family and their partners or family and neighbors, on the reservation. Next one, Andy. And that's the final one. That's my contact information. If anybody would like to give me a call or juke me an email, I'd be more than happy to visit with you about anything we've talked about here today. I do have one final statement I want to make. Since this is a webinar on climate change, I will tell you that over the last 20 years, the fire season has increased by 45 days. In both the spring and the fall. So with climate change, we're looking at a 90-day longer fire season. We are looking at much greater catastrophic wildfires. As you all are aware, California burnt millions of acres last year. Western Oregon had a 500-year fire event, which I'm afraid is going to be repeated in a lot less time than 500 years if we don't do some management. And the fire, we no longer call it a fire season. We call it a fire year because of the additional days now, the 90 days that have been added to it by Mother Nature because of climate change. Fire suppression used to be what we did in the summer, and we did prescribed burning in the spring and in the fall and burn piles in the winter, and that's not the case anymore. We're ready to suppress fires any time of the year. And as a federal land management agency, a federal fire agency, we are also, we could be requested to go to California or to go to Arizona or Texas or anywhere in the United States to help out. So, there is no doubt that climate change is having a pretty profound effect on wildfire suppression and also on our ability to use fire as a management tool. It's narrowing our windows, and we're having to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more paying attention a little bit better on things so that we can keep fire within the control line. Okay, that was the end of my babble. I really appreciate everybody's time. Colleen, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, and that's all I got.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was awesome. This is the presentation that when we were going through it, we were like, there is too much good information here to lose any of it. And so we're really thankful again to Wenix to moving her presentation to later this spring. And the information that you shared was amazing and incredible. I am going to ask one question that came really specifically through the chat. Fred Hill wanted to know, Andy, if the wood from those dead trees would be made available as firewood.
Certainly that's possible. When we do the commercial timber harvests, a lot of the wood we try to remove just because there's so much of it, and some of it has value as sawlog, some of it has value as pulpwood, and then some of it doesn't really have any value, and we retain some of it in the stand. It's something we're working on, is to make more of that wood available. From our last timber sales, we do have some piles available. We just need to figure out a way of getting them down to Mission to be distributed to tribal elders, but it's something we're working on. So certainly there's plenty of fuel wood up in the woods. The issue is how do we get it down and available for people?
Thank you. We're going to say the rest of our